Hello, this is another story for Halloween. It's also the story I was planning to tell on Saturday at the Seven Deadly Stories event, symbolising the sin of gluttony. But as that event has been postponed for another year, I don't suppose it matters if I tell it now. It's the tale of King Erysichthon of ancient Greece. The king, mighty and powerful upon his throne, summons to him the architect, and said, "Bring in your plans, lay them out upon this feasting table here, that we may see how you have drawn them up. For we are eager to have the building begun. The great feast of the Erysichthon is only a few months away. I want this feasting hall built and ready, so that when I invite all of the local lords and ladies, the chieftains and the kings from all of the neighbouring realms, they might look upon my hall, its opulence, its magnificence, its size, its scale, its grandeur, and be green with envy. May they quake in their boots to see the opulence that is possessed of the family of Erysichthon." Well, the architect unfurled the plans upon the table and said, "Your honour, your mightiness, there is a problem in the building of the hall, in the way that you have described. We can build it, we can make it opulent, we can fill it with the carvings and the jewels and the tapestries and all of the things you've said you wanted. But there is a question of scale." "What is the problem?" demanded the king. "Well, your majesty, if we extend it another 25 yards, we will come to the ornate fountain placed in the royal gardens by your grandfather." "Ah! Fill it in! Move it! Put it somewhere else!" "We can do that," said the architect, "but if we then extend it to the full 50 yards extra that you have requested, we come to the sacred grove of the goddess Demeter. We can hardly remove the trees." "Why not?" said the king. "Chop them down. Another grove can be planted somewhere else. What does it matter?" And a gasp rippled around the royal court, as the courtiers and the ladies in waiting and his wife and his daughter and the architect and even the slaves themselves and the guards looked in horror to hear these words from the mouth of the king. "Chop down the sacred glade of the goddess Demeter?" asked the architect. "Is that what you said?" Sure, he must have misheard or misunderstood. "Indeed, chop it down," said the king. "Another one may be put somewhere else. What do a few old trees matter? Have it removed." Well, the priestess of the glade came and she implored, she begged, she threatened. She called upon the goddess herself to witness this act of blasphemy. Yes, another glade might be planted, but this was a sacred glade that stood upon that spot for 300 years that were known of, and possibly longer. It would be a travesty, an insult to the gods themselves to hack it down just to build a hall of such cheap ostentatiousness. Well, the king, grown tired of her rantings, had her carted away in chains and ordered the building works to begin the very next day. And in the morning, when the king came out to supervise the first cutting of the sod to begin the building works, as was the custom of the day, the architect came up to him and said, "Majesty, we have another problem." "What is it this time?" said the king. "I have instructed the slaves on all of the building works that need doing. They will move the fountain laid in place by your grandfather. They will fill it in. They will cut down all of the other trees. They will uproot all of the flower beds and bushes in the royal garden. They will do all of that. But they live in terror of cutting down the sacred trees of Demeter. They have begged, they have pleaded. 4 of them have fled at risk of their own lives. I have threatened them with whippings and executions and all manner of things, but nothing will bring them to pick up an axe and take it to the holy trees." "Then give me the axe," said the king, storming in a fury down to the holy glade, summoning all of the slaves and the builders to come and watch what he was about to do, to prove their weakness and his strength. And the winds began to whip up, and the ancient oak trees that formed the circle of the glade, decorated with flowers and garlands and beautiful offerings over the centuries, began to creak and groan and sway in that terrible whipping wind, and the slaves began to quake, and the architect quaked, and his builders quaked, for fear of what was about to happen to them all. Erysichthon, a huge, powerful man who had been a warrior in his youth and was only now just into the beginnings of middle age, took that axe and with a mighty hack smashed it into the oldest, the mightiest, the grandest of the oak trees that grew in the glade of Demeter. And as the axe bit in deep, thunder roared in the distance. Again and again, blow after blow after blow shattered into the bark, with wood chippings flying hither and flying yon, splinters here and splinters there, and even a splinter stuck in his hands and his arms. He continued to hack and hack and hack as his own blood fell upon the earth, and the winds whipped up higher and higher, and the trees swayed them all, groaning and creaking, and leaves dropping hither and yon. The slaves were gibbering with fear. The builders and the architects huddled as far from the glade as they dare get without offending the king. Until at last Erysichthon had done what he intended to do. Knowing he wasn't strong enough one man to chop down such a mighty tree, he nonetheless ringed it all the way round, ensuring that the tree was dead. And with the final slash of the axe to complete the ringing of the bark, there came a terrible crack and a scream as the dryad within the tree died. And although he had only ringed the tree and not hacked it through to its core, the top part of the tree began to creak and twist and turn and toppled, almost hitting the king himself and flattening the architect and 3 of his builders. A terrible scream went up from the slaves and the guards, and a voice spoke in the sudden stilling of the winds. "Erysichthon! You have blasphemed against me. You dare defile my sacred grove for greed, for gluttony, for show and ostentation. Know this: your appetite will never be satisfied, no matter how grand your hall." And with that, the voice of Demeter dissipated upon the wind, and all was still. The slaves, threatened with their own lives and seeing that the worst had already been done, set to in removing the rest of the trees from the holy glade and dragging their roots from the earth. And in the coming weeks, the pond was filled in and the fountain moved elsewhere. The flower beds were uprooted, the floorboards and the foundations laid for the extension of the great feasting hall, the pillars put up, the tapestries, the carvings, the jewels inlaid upon the walls, paintings upon the boards, paintings upon the floors. It was the most fabulous, most expensive, most elaborate feasting hall that had been seen in Greece in living memory and probably beyond. And when the invites were sent out, that all of the local royalty and gentry should come and take part in the grandest of feasts, 2/3 of the invites were refused, with all manner of excuses offered. But the truth of the matter was, the story of the curse of Demeter had spread across the land, and no one in their right mind, or almost no one in their right mind, wanted to come and feast in a hall which the goddess herself had cursed. But 1/3 were not in their right mind. They were, after all, royal. So they came to the feast, and scarcely a quarter of the hall was populated by them, and the rest of the hall was taken up with musicians and acrobats and jugglers and tumblers and all manner of entertainers. Dish after dish after dish was brought out and laid upon the great long table, around which so small a number of guests were seated. And as the music played and the rexina flowed, And guests stuffed their faces until they were near passing out. The king himself sat there and ate and drank and drank 4 times as much as any of his guests, and he still seemed to eat and eat and eat into the wee small hours until his wife besides him was nearly passing out unconscious under the table, and his daughter, looking much the worse for wear, said, "Father, can we not now go to bed? The guests are snoring at the tables. You know nobody can stand and retire until you yourself stand and retire. Please, let us go to bed. Enough is enough." And if it were not for the pleading of his beloved daughter Mestra, he would have gone eating and eating and eating until the dawnlight rose. But eventually he did retire, taking a large leg of lamb with him to his bedchamber. And in the morning not one of the guests could stomach the slightest food for breakfast, for they were bloated. And yet the king himself came down into the feasting hall, and seeing so much left over, he set to consuming and consuming and consuming until his wife, who by this time had herself recovered, came and said, "Husband, you will make yourself ill. You can't possibly eat all of this." And the husband looked at her and said, There is something wrong with this food. It tastes well enough, but I am famished. I feel as if I haven't eaten for days." And even as he said so, there was gravy dripping down his beard and staining his robes. He had a leg of lamb in one hand and a joint of beef in the other, eating and eating and eating, and making his wife feel physically sick to look at him. The amount he was consuming, she had never seen the likes of it before. Even the pigs down at the farm didn't consume this much. And it continued, day after day after day, until, at the pleading of his wife and his daughter, he had the priestess of Demeter released from the dungeons where she'd been kept. And she consented with the pleading of the wife and the daughter, more so than anything said by the ever-hungry king, to go and bless the new glade where a few saplings had been planted to replace the desecrated glade that the ancestors of the priestess had once planted. She did so with a heavy heart, and the hopes of the king's wife and daughter that this would appease Demeter and she would lift her curse came to nothing, for he continued to be ungovernably hungry. And in the 9 days since the great feast was held, he had eaten and eaten and eaten, and put upon a good 2.5 stone, such that he now had double chins where once he had had a firm jaw, such that his clothing had to be let out and his belly hung down over his belt. And as for the flatulence and the diarrhoea, it doesn't bear thinking of, but to consume so much food will take its toll upon even the most royal of frames. 9 days rolled into 15 days, and still it continued. And the wife and daughter, they begged and they pleaded with the priestess, could she not make offerings, make sacrifices to Demeter? She was known to accept pigs and grain and all manner of things. The entire farm was emptied with offerings to Demeter. But still the hunger continued unabated. The kitchens cooked day and night. Meal after meal after meal was served to the king, and in between great big banquets, far more elaborate than any of them would normally eat in their day-to-day routine, he was still demanding olives and cheese and bread and meat and fruit and wine and mead and beer. On and on and on it went, until the head chef in the kitchen came and spoke first to the queen and then to her daughter and then to the king himself and said, "Our budgets are stretched beyond coping. So much money has been spent on building this fabulous feasting hall that there is so little left to go into the kitchens. Were you eating normally, that would not be a problem, but feeding the king on a day-to-day basis costs more than feeding a small army on a day-to-day basis." Well, weeks rolled into months, And still the king continued to eat and eat and eat, until at the end of 6 months he had put upon 7 stone in weight. He was getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. His belly was enormous to behold. His backside filled the throne and hung over either side. He seldom got any exercise. Once this fit man who would ride and wrestle and go hunting and climbing of mountains and all manner of things, was now just huge and did little beyond eating and drinking and locking himself in the water closet for hours upon end to cope with the aftermath of it all. Months rolled into a full year. And whilst the kingdom had once been rich, so much money had gone on the building of the hall, so much money had gone on physicians to treat the king, on priests and priestesses from all over Greece to perform blessings and exorcisms and banishing spells, upon wizards and witches and herb wives and healers trying this potion and this talisman and that talisman, and upon the food bill and the drink bill for the king alone, that the kingdom was on the very edge of bankruptcy. His wife, despairing, called to her brothers and said, what may be done? And they said, well, the throne passes down your line. Many a wife has been put aside by a husband. Perhaps it's time for the wife to put aside her husband. Find yourself another king. Put him out of the kingdom before he eats every last coin in the treasury, and you are reduced to penury and fall prey to all of your rivals who would happily besiege this kingdom. Indeed, they didn't even need to do that. The soldiers haven't been paid in months. They would probably gladly let some rival monarch walk in if they offered to pay their missing wages. Well, it took another 3 months of continued gluttony, continuing poverty, continuing despair, before finally the queen agreed to have this marriage disbanded, to put her husband from her. And she called to Erysichthon and explained the situation to him, and his brother-in-law stood there heavily armed and made clear the situation to him. The time had come for him to go. And the only daughter of the king and queen Maestra, she, heartbroken to see the state her father had fallen into, bloated beyond all description, now more than double his original weight, with chin upon chin upon chin and belly upon belly upon belly, eating and vomiting and farting and exploding and eating some more. A wretched, putrid, smelly, debased mess of a man. Even with all of that, she could not bring it in her heart to let her father wander the world unaided, untended, unhelped and unloved, and said to her mother, I will go with him this while, and until some cure can be found. Perhaps if we make a pilgrimage to one of the great shrines of Demeter, she might forgive him his terrible act of desecration and lift this curse from him. And her mother, although she didn't want to see her daughter go, equally didn't really want to see her husband abandoned to a horrible death. And so she agreed. And by this point, Erysichthon was so large his own legs were no longer able to sustain him. And so, with the aid of a lot of rather large servants, they hauled this enormous man onto the back of a wagon, hitched up to a couple of horses. And guided by Maestra, his daughter, they made their way out of the kingdom and began to travel upon the roads. And she did her best to look after him, using the buckets provided to fetch water from rivers to try and wash the terrible mess from her father. And all of the while, as the poor old horses hauled this enormous weight with a wagon groaning from side to side, Erysichthon would call out, I'm hungry! Feed me! I haven't eaten for minutes. But all of the while, no matter how many olives and how much bread and cheese and meat and fruit and lasagna and everything else that was tipped down his throat, it made no difference to him. He was just as hungry. Famished, starved. To look upon him, he was bloated beyond description, but his daughter knew that inside he was like a starving man, a walking skeleton in his own mind, if not in physical reality. And after 3 months of travelling the roads, of begging food, this king and princess reduced to begging food from passing strangers, who would give the food to her, for she did indeed look thin and ragged and ill-dressed. But when they saw the enormous man in the back demanding food, few would part with food for someone who looked as if they had eaten enough to feed 10 people, let alone one. The desperation became worse and worse. Neither of them had ever really done a proper day's work in their life. They tried to make ends meet as best they could, but they had sold off their rings, they had sold off the fine silks and exchanged them for rough chitons. They had sold off anything worth selling off, most of it going on food, occasionally on hiring a barn that they could park the horses and the wagon in and sleep in overnight. But despair was setting in. Maestra was beside herself with grief, thinking, what can we do? And they sat there in the shadow of an olive tree. The former king sprawled like a great melting waxen pool of flesh in the back of the wagon. The horses looking half dead from exhaustion. Maestra looking half dead from exhaustion, when a well-dressed man rode past, and seeing the state of this poor girl, stopped and said, "May I help you? Have you been robbed? Has some terrible fate befallen you?" And she spoke to him with all of the aristocratic accents and mannerisms of one so well born. And she said, my father is labouring under a terrible curse. We must do something. He is starving. And I know he doesn't look as if he's starving, but in his mind he is starving. I must get him some food. I must get myself some food. I must get the horses some hay. What are we to do? And this wealthy merchant said, "You are a beautiful young woman. I would acquire your services. In exchange, your father may have enough money to feed himself for 6 months." And privately, Maestra thought to herself that he would probably get through that money in a couple of weeks, let alone 6 months. But at once the king said, "Sold! Take my daughter, leave me the money, and one of your slaves there that were in the train behind the merchant, that I may send the slave to fetch me food from market and bring it back here, for as you can see, I cannot walk myself." And the deal was struck, and poor Maestra, weeping to be sold into slavery, she who was so high-born, reduced to the lowest position in society, joined the wagon of the merchant as it rolled off towards his great villa. And her tears were heard as they were passing along the coastal path. For Maestra had been beloved of the mighty sea god Poseidon, and Poseidon heard her weeping and looked down and saw her plight, and his heart was moved, his heart was broken. But as the sea roared up, a great splashing wave fell upon the merchant and his slaves, including his new slave. Not a big enough wave to wash them out to sea, but just to dampen them a little. And as the water fell upon Maestra herself, Poseidon blessed her with a gift all of his own. And finally they arrived at the merchant's villa, and the slaves showed her to a slave quarters and took the instructions of their owner that she should be washed and scrubbed and properly dressed, and then brought that evening to his private chambers. When she had been washed and dressed and properly scrubbed, she could feel that strange presence of Poseidon beside her, burning within her, heard his voice whispering in her ear, instructing her what to do. For Poseidon is a mighty shapeshifter, and had blessed his beloved with the gift to change her form. And so she shucked off the elegant clothes that her new owner had given her, stretched her arms, grew wings, and became a falcon, and flew from the window, flew far away from this man who would enslave her to his desires. She flew and she flew and she flew back to where she remembered her father being, in the shadow of that olive tree, and hoped that he was still there. And it took her all night and half the next day, because she had no real idea where she was in the country. She just flew and flew and flew until finally, after endless searching, she spotted the tree and the horses and the wagon, and she flew down and resumed her human shape. And there she saw the horses, exhausted, half dead. Of the slave that had been left behind, there was no sight. He had gone off to market to who knows where. And she rushed to peer into the back of the wagon and said, "Father, I have returned." Despite the fact that he had sold her, she loved him still. And she looked into the back of the wagon, holding her nose, quite prepared for that terrible smell that came from all of the excesses of his body. And she stopped, shocked more than she had ever been shocked by the sight of him before. For there he was, sprawled with vomit here, and stains that we won't even think of there, and great bloody patches over his tunic, for the slave, having run off with the money, knowing that his new owner was hardly in a position to run after him, had abandoned him and kept the money for himself. And Erysichthon, having gone hour upon hour upon hour without anything to eat, had started by eating the bits of straw in the back of the wagon. And when that had failed to fill the pit, the gnawing pit of his stomach, he had taken to eating his own moobs, chewing upon his own flesh, devouring it, swallowing it, great bloody gulps and goblets of his own fat swallowed down his own mighty throat. And the blood here and the blood there and the blood upon his arms, where he had chewed great lumps from his own arms, until finally the shock of it and the pain of it and the blood loss of it had carried him from there into the darkest recesses of Hades, where his soul may reside still, for all I know. Thank you.